Noel, depending how you want to pronounce it, DaCunha, living in a small rural town of Westlock, Alberta, which is about an hour north of Edmonton. And I've been in Westlock for some 34 years, having been in the small town of Manville for 4 years before then, and having come from the UK after medical school and residency training. And did my high school education in the UK, having lived in Uganda, East Africa. Before then, born in India, but left at a very early age to head to Uganda. My father's parents came from a place called Goa, which is on the west coast of India, and was at that time and until 1960 a Portuguese colony. So the story behind that is that back in the late 1400s, the Portuguese were a great seafaring nation and went and explored, extended their Portuguese empire really all over the world. And that's where they got to, that's where Brazil came from, on the other side of the world. And that's where they found the sea route to India, which was something people were looking for because the overland trip to India for trade was not so easy. And so in 1497, around the Cape of Good Hope, South Africa, across the Indian Ocean, and landed on the west coast of India. And that's the first for the discovery of the sea route to India. And then everything followed after that. And they established a small colony there, which was Goa. And that's where all the local people there who were originally probably Hindu, I think, really a good many of them with the Portuguese influence, names change, and that's where the name DaCunha comes from. And religion became Roman Catholic. So India was a part of the British Empire for till 1948. So there was all this British influence around Goa, and there was the Portuguese influence in Goa, and then the British, of course, were in Africa as well. And around the late 1800s, they're building a railway in East Africa, and they encouraged Indian workers to go over and help build the railway. And that was the first presence of people from India in East Africa. And then what followed was some immigration. And that was people wanting to trade, start businesses, etc. And there was quite a large Indian immigration to East Africa, to Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, South Africa, and that's why there is and continues to be we'll call it a South Asian Indian presence in those countries. And what that resulted in was quite a sizable Indian community in East Africa. And they occupied that sort of middle ground between the ruling British and the local Africans, the traders, and then they became the professionals, and most of the cities were occupied by Indians, with the African population kind of being on the periphery in the villages. And that's what evolved in East Africa into the 1900s and beyond. So my father's parents at the turn of the century, beginning early 1900s, as a young couple, went to Uganda, set up a small trading business there, and did quite well. So that's where he was born, around 1925, and he grew up in Uganda, and then, but in those days, if anybody wanted to get any further education, they had to leave the country and go elsewhere because of opportunities. So his parents arranged for him to, it was during the war, head to India to finish high school and hopefully go to medical school. And that's a story in itself, because during the war, transportation and how to get to India from Africa. I think he went in an Arab trading vessel. It was the only way to get across the ocean. Went to India and finished his high school education, got into medical school, and did his medical education there. And it just so happened my mother was a fellow medical student there who wasn't a Goan Roman Catholic, but a higher caste Hindu Brahmin. And so that was a good match in the late 40s, early 50s. But I mean, fortunately, they came from fairly progressive families and got married around 1970, 71. So I'm pushing 14, 15 years old, halfway through secondary school. The political situation in Uganda, as in a lot of um, third world countries, are a bit unstable. And the reason for that isn't totally the local people's fault. The borders they had were artificial created by the colonial power that divided these countries up way back. And then you had all the different tribal groups there who didn't agree with each other. And then in the British rule, they favored one against the other, and some had more influence. And so the whole tribal thing is very, very big there now. As the Indian population were a little separate from all that stuff going on in the background. But anyway, the bottom line was that there was an army military coup in 1971 with the army because everything was so badly mismanaged, or so they said. They had to take over the country to straighten things out and get everything back online, as any revolution or any coup says. So, we wake up one morning and there's the sound of gunfire coming from the army barracks, which was a couple of miles from where we lived. And then we keep quiet, and next thing we know, there's a new government in power. So we lived in this town called Ginger, which is 50 miles from the capital, Kampala, and it's actually at the source of where the River Nile flows out of Lake Victoria. So the source of the Nile as it flows northwards towards Egypt. So quite a pleasant place to grow up. And we, growing up there as a young teenager, riding our bikes into the forest and down to the river and looking at the hippos and, that kind of stuff, and then playing cricket in the backyard. I mean, that was a very pleasant upbringing. But then this other stuff was going on. And soon after this coup, over the next few months, we could get a sense that things weren't going well. Stories about people disappearing. My father was the medical officer of health of the town we lived in. So he was at that sort of town council level, looking after the health side of things. And alongside him was the town treasurer and the town engineer and the town education guy, etc. And they were all local Africans, and he was Indian. And each of them belonged to a different tribe, and then one of them disappeared, and then another one, and then a third one, and so there was all this stuff going on. And as the medical officer of health, we got a sense that every now and then there'd be gunfire coming from the barracks a couple of miles away. We didn't know what was going on, and then later you hear about whatever the cleansing that was going on in the army with the tribalism and that kind of stuff. So all kinds of bad stuff happening. And then in August 1972, the General Idi Amin was the one who had organized the coup and taken over the country. And he's a bit of a sort of maverick kind of guy with all kinds of strange ideas, and you may have heard of him. But again, responsible for all some of the atrocities and everything else that went on. Now, in August 72, he announced that all the Indian people in the country who had to leave the country within 90 days because they were bad people and they'd exploited the country and they ran all the businesses and were bad for the country and that kind of stuff, and so they had to leave. Technically, we could have stayed with the Ugandan citizenship thing, but it would be a pretty um, dangerous thing to do, to stay on in the country with everybody else leaving, not knowing what the future held for you. So my father hung on to his original British citizenship, and so we were essentially British Indians having to leave the country, and that was a chaotic time. So as you can imagine, and same as happens now when you have a crisis, the Canadians and the Americans and the Australians showed up with their, with their diplomatic staff trying to process or would be refugees, immigrants, to try and help people leave the country to meet the deadline, etc. And we were part of that uh, confusion and exodus. And so my parents, trying to do the best for us, we went to the Australian High Commission, to the Canadian High Commission, to the American Embassy. And they actually, after the nicest people to deal with, and I remember that were the Canadians. And I think they still are when it comes to international affairs. I mean, here you've got these desperate would-be immigrants, and you don't have to be nice to them. They're desperate, but they're so nice. And my parents actually got visas at that time. Visas. I've got a copy of that to come to a place called Edmonton, Alberta, in 1972. And the reason we didn't take that up was just the difficulty of their teenage children with their Ugandan education, which is on a British model, to transition to North American Canadian system would be pretty difficult, and which is why they opted for the UK, which wouldn't have been their first choice for them to go, but really more for the education of their children, where it was a smoother transition because it was the same examination boards. So that took us to Britain, and then things were getting more and more difficult in Uganda. Every time you drove anywhere, you came across army checkpoints on the road with soldiers and guns pointing at you as they checked your vehicles and stuff. Now, when I look back, I think of how potentially serious and dangerous and vulnerable we were, because if you think of what happened in Rwanda next door to Uganda and other countries of the world, when you had marauding soldiers all over the place, we were fairly lucky to leave unscathed, but it didn't seem too bad at the time. And we headed to England in December 72. And we were, I mean, it sounds scary, and I suppose it was, but really, in terms of luck and good fortune and the way things worked out, really, we did well. I mean, if you look at how a lot of immigrants do when they go to new countries from a strife and upheaval and all the rest of it, we did relatively well. And we go to the UK. My sister's 18, my brother's 17. I'm pushing 16. My sister below me is 14. The younger sister's 10. So all these, my parents had like $200 in the pocket. And that's all we had. And they go there, and social services get involved. It's the whole refugee thing, get housed. And it didn't take us too long to find our feet. Parents got jobs, and we had donate charity housing and furniture and stuff. But it didn't take us long to stand on our own 2 feet. So I finished medical school in the UK. I decided, yes, family medicine was the way to go. Got into a family medicine training program, and that's 4 years over there. And really, a really good training with, if you know a little bit about medical training, emergency medicine and maternity care and internal medicine and pediatrics, and it was all part of the training, and so felt well accomplished. In medical school, met my wife, who was a nurse, a nursing student, and the medical student nurse student type thing, which happened. It's quite a common story, and so married. And then after my medical school training, that happens at that time, family medicine jobs in the UK were pretty tight, and the ideal family practice in the UK would be a small practice in a village. That's what everybody would aspire to. Totally different from this country, where everybody wants to be in the big city, not in some small town. And so looking around for jobs, and and I went to a fairly prestigious medical school, probably possibly the oldest medical school maybe in the world, founded in 1123. Anyway, that was in London, and so not having difficulty finding a job, and I was working with a doctor, my internal medicine boss, who knew a physician in Manville, Alberta, was always looking for people to come and join him. And what my boss had done in the past was sent over people like myself who wanted to work for 6 months at a time or something and see what it's like and help him out because he was a single doctor in a small town of Manville, Alberta. So he asked me if I wanted to go along, and at that time, a wife and a baby, one baby, said, sure, why not see what it's like and maybe stay, maybe come back. And I had no idea where Manville was. I had no idea where Alberta was. It could have been in Nunavut for all I knew, for all I knew. But yes, it's a small town in sort of east central Alberta, 800 people. There's one doctor there. And arrived in Manville, Alberta on the 1st of January, 1986. The doctor there comes to meet me and says hello. And he was trained in Britain himself. And we get in his vehicle and drive to Manville, which is about 2 hours east of Edmonton. And the first thing that struck me was that there are no streetlights. And you're driving to Manville along the highway, and it's dark, and there's no lights. There's a farmhouse over there, and then you look into the distance, and there's another one over there, and and that's it. And of course, there's snow everywhere and everything. So how does that work for any other new immigrant family coming to a small town in rural Canada? I think that there's several factors there. It's what you're prepared to, what you're willing to give, and and sometimes enthusiasm is reciprocal. In that we go there and we're keen to get involved in local activities, and it didn't take long before we're snowmobiling and ice fishing and doing all that stuff that goes on there. That's in the winter, and then summer rolls around, and I've never put a hole in the ground. And next thing I know, we're planting a garden, and there's a local golf club, and then the hunting season comes along, and I've never even fired a gun, but taking, next thing you know, we're hunting deer and geese and ducks, and so really embraced everything that rural Alberta had to offer. When I arrived, things were pretty straightforward in that in rural Alberta, we did everything from we looked after the local emergency department and looked after maternities and had patients in the hospital, etc. Referred any serious stuff to Edmonton. So that was rural family medicine. Um, and over the years, I mean, as anywhere else, things have got busier and a little more organized, and there have been some good innovations with technology and communication systems, patient involvement in their healthcare. And it just so happens that right now I'm the president of the Alberta College of Family Physicians, and so heavily involved in innovations in primary healthcare. And but what we've seen over the years is some difficulties with rural medicine, and that trying to keep families in keep doctors in family medicine and encourage them to work in family medicine. And if you look at recruitment, and I do a lot of, I was in Manville for 4 years, but then we moved to Westlaw. And one of the reasons I moved was because I've got the desire to teach, to do more obstetrics, to just be in a bigger center and more involvement with the University of Alberta. So I've got a faculty appointment with the University of Alberta and do a lot of teaching in Westlock. But anyway, so the challenges we're facing right now is trying to get more family physicians in rural Alberta, and it's probably the same everywhere in Canada. But we have about 700,000 Albertans who do not have a family physician. And we're right in the middle, even as we speak, in innovations and modernizing the primary care system and looking at remuneration models and recruitment stuff. And there's the same going on elsewhere in the country. So hopefully things will, and right, so right now we've got a bit of although we have a very good healthcare system, we still have a crisis in family medicine, particularly rural family medicine. So in rural family medicine, you look after patients and their families and the parents and the children and the grandchildren, and you see them at home when they get admitted to hospital. They're admitted under your care, and you send them home, and 2 weeks later you're seeing them yourself. So there's this whole home to hospital to home circuit, which is the same doctor. And if you get a phone call from a patient or from hospital, you're dealing with for a good part your own patients. And that is something what I find very satisfying about that and trying to get that message across.